Hello everyone, Darcy Bono here. In this video we're going to look at painting World Eaters in a slightly warmer tone like the ones that you see here in this concept art. As you can see in the recesses, it has a little bit more brown than some of the gray, cooler whites that are frequently depicted. We're also going to cover how to do the blue and the gold trim, so you'll get all three of the main colors for painting your World Eaters. So we have a nice big surface to work with. We're going to be doing this on a Terminator, also known as a Devourer in the World Eaters parlance, and I've primed this one in Wraithbone spray. For this first step, we're just going to mix a shade coat using Skeleton Horde contrast and Basilicanum Grey, mixed in about a 2-to-1 ratio. I've also included a single drop of water in this mixture just so it acts more like a shade coat and flows into the recesses rather than saturating the raised portions. So then all you're going to do is coat every surface that you want to be eventually white, coat it in this mixture. This was going to provide our deepest shadow as well as our warm undertones. So don't be overly cautious with this. You can kind of go nuts with it. You don't even have to worry too much about coffee staining, that oversaturation or blotchy look, because we're going to be taking care of that with stippling in the next step. And I have been asked, hey, can I just use Agrax Earthshade? That's brown. And yes, you technically could. I don't find it to be the same color. It's got a lot more red to it, especially when you put it over a warm cream color like Wraithbone. You definitely get a much more red brown than this coffee brown that you see here. And once the shade coat is dry, your miniature should look something like this. For this next step, we are going to be doing some stippling using a small concealer brush. This is a makeup brush, a cosmetic brush with a rounded tip to it that we're going to be using almost like a dry brush. We're kind of going to combine dry brushing with the more jabbing technique of stippling, and you'll see that in just a moment. I'm going to be using Wraithbone again to bring that white back up to where it was, but we're going to avoid the recesses and just lightly pat the surface of the armor, and you'll see immediately it starts getting a more like textured, rugged look to it. And there's really not much to stippling. It's very similar to dry brushing in the way that its success depends on making sure most of the paint is removed from your brush and checking your pattern before applying it to the model. As you saw in my finger, just make sure that it is giving a speckled effect rather than a huge blotch. And right now, this is going to look a little bit stark, a little bit too much contrast, but keep in mind, we're going to be doing additional layers of this, so it'll look a little bit more cohesive rather than the dark brown base with a splotchy white pattern over top. Once you do multiple layers of this, it's going to look infinitely better. So on these smaller surfaces, like what you would run into on a Space Marine, you're going to just do kind of a standard dry brush, going against the grain on the most textured portion of those surfaces so that it catches on those textures. And I'm going to slow it back down so you can see this. Any major textured surfaces, like all these edges around the face here, the edges on the knuckle joints as well, you can just do a standard dry brush for those. It'll catch on the textures and give you the same effect. And once you're done stippling the larger surfaces and dry brushing the textured ones, your armor should look like this. In this next step, we're going to be using Praxeti White as our highlight color. If you don't have this, you can basically make it just by adding a little bit of white to Wraithbone just to lighten it a little bit. So all we're going to be doing is the exact same thing we did before, but focusing a little bit more on the edges. We don't want to entirely coat the surface in this like we did before with the Wraithbone. Just make your touch slightly lighter than before and make sure you keep it mostly to the edges. It's okay if you bring it in just a little bit, but you don't want it to overshadow the previous layer of Wraithbone on the surfaces that are closer to the recesses. For this very final part of the white armor, we're going to be applying a fine highlight using a traditional chisel tip dry brush and a pure white. In this case, I'm using CITADEL's White Scar. So all we're doing here is just very lightly highlighting the very sharpest edges. So here on the center of the neck, the back of the shins, any hard edge you're going to lightly touch with this pure white. And the reason we're using a chisel tip dry brush as opposed to our concealer brush with the rounded edge to it is because this chisel tip will connect directly with the sharp edges but not provide that gradient that you get when you dry brush with the more tightly packed bristles and rounded surface of the makeup brush. All we want to do is catch the edges, and this chisel tip does exactly that. And that is the final step for the white armor. Now, right now, it doesn't look like much. The reason being, everything on here is white. We're gonna add some color and it's going to change dramatically how bright this actually looks. So let's go ahead and do the blue before proceeding on to the metals. So the recipe for the blue armor is highly ironic. We're going to get started with a base coat of Macragge Blue. Really not much to this, just base coat everywhere that you want to be blue with this color. And just to point out my own error here, this Terminator is missing his underlayer of pauldrons. So sorry about that. Make sure when you put yours together that there are in fact 2 pauldrons on their shoulders. I've since corrected this problem and will be paying more attention to my assembly instructions in the future. Next, we're going to be mixing a highlight color using an even ratio of Fenrisian Grey and Macragge Blue, and we're not going to add any water to this because we're going to be doing the same stippling dry brushing that we did earlier. That being said, we are going to be using a concealer brush again. Now, I do recommend using a fresh one just so you don't have to worry about chalky buildup in the bristles, and so you don't have to worry about the previous dry brushed colors skewing the ones you've just mixed. And same as before, make sure to get most of the paint off your brush and test your pattern on another surface before applying it to the model. So you're just going to do the exact same technique you did before, just the short stabbing, stippling motions, and creating highlight and texture while avoiding the recesses. Next, we're going to be doing a second highlight with just straight Fenrisian Grey this time, and again just stippling the edges, not going quite as far in, and you can be pretty heavy-handed with this. Don't worry too much about it looking too light or too contrasting, because we're going to be applying a glaze over this to help kind of tone it all together. And as you can see there, a little bit of this highlight got too far into the recess right there on the waistline. If this happens to you, don't sweat it. The glaze we're going to do in the next step not only blends these blues together, but we can just run it in the recess and darken it again. For this final step on the blue portions, we're going to be mixing a glaze out of, again, ironically, 2 drops of Ultramarines Blue and 3 drops of Lamian Medium. And all you're going to be doing is just lightly applying this to all the blue surfaces, focusing on the recesses. Now, if you apply too much, like I did here, take your Lamian Medium, just Lamian Medium, and kind of pull some of that glaze away from the surface wherever it's oversaturated. And here's what I meant about using this glaze to darken any excessive highlights. Just focus it on wherever you over highlighted, and it's good. Now, this final step is optional if you prefer this brighter shade of blue. However, I want it to be a little bit closer to the blue in the initial artwork I showed at the beginning of this video, so I'm adding a thin coat of Basilicanum Grey just to dull the blue down just a little bit. I feel like it matches a little bit more with the warmer, kind of grungier tones that we've created. So I'm dulling this down just a little bit, just so it's not quite so clean and vibrant looking. And with our blue surfaces completed, we're going to be moving on to the metal ones with a base coat of Iron Hand Steel. Now we're going to be using this color for both the gold trim and for the gunmetal surfaces of the claws and the kind of internal metal areas. Now this may seem a little strange, but just bear with me. You're going to see in just a sec how to change this to either gold or gunmetal. And while we're at it, we'll also apply a base coat of black to these claws. In this case, I'm using black Templar contrast, but really any black will work. Abaddon black watered down, even a black ink if you wish. We just want to create a very dark shadow because we're going to be dry brushing with a silver metallic later to create a kind of fade into a dark metal. And speaking of dark metals, we are going to be painting the inlays and kind of internal components using Basilicanum Grey with just a speck of black Templar in it just to darken it a little bit. This will essentially create a metallic black that contrasts nicely with the white armor. For the gold trim, we're just going to be applying a very dense coat of Skeleton Horde contrast. Now, because the base coat is essentially just a gray metallic, it's going to give this tan color a much more muted effect. So right away, it starts looking more like an antique gold, which you can then highlight up if you wish using Liberator Gold, but I kind of like this more dingy look. So I'm just going to do straight Skeleton Horde over all of the gold trim. And that is literally all I'm going to do for the gold. Once you put this on, it's finished. And while we have our three basic World Eater colors, white, blue, and muted gold, all complete now, I figured I'd go ahead and just show you how to do the claws in case you wanted to do any similar metal effects on your World Eaters. So what we're going to do is just lightly dry brush these, starting from the tips, using Iron Hand Steel again. And once again, we'll be using a small concealer brush to do this dry brushing, just since it gives such a nice gradient effect. And finally, we're just going to apply a light highlight using Necron Compound, though you can use any bright silver you like, Stormhost Silver, Runefang Steel, those both work. But we're going to have a much lighter stroke than before, and we're not going to bring this color all the way to the joints as we did with the previous one. Just lightly graze the edges and the tips of the claws. So this isn't prevalent on all World Eaters, but we are going to paint the little gladiatorial fringe you see here. And we're going to create this dark muted red using 1 drop of Flesh Terror's Red and 3 drops of Basilicanum Grey. And don't forget your contrast medium or thinner medium, just so it flows a little bit better as you're painting. After that, there's not much to it, just apply this to the leather straps and you're pretty much done. No additional highlighting required. Alright, and with that, our miniature is complete. Now, I totally get it, this is a World Eater's Terminator. He should be slathered in blood, you know, kind of like this. So if you want to see how I do my blood and gore effect, stay tuned, that's coming up next. It is on a Space Marine, just because I finished the Space Marine before I finished this guy. But the same concept applies, and you can use this as a foundation for the subsequent video. So this is just how to do your World Eaters start to finish, and then you can slather them in blood. So I hope you learned something, I hope this was enjoyable, and if it was, remember to subscribe and support the channel if you'd like to see more content in the future. So thanks very much again for watching, and until we meet again, happy painting everyone!